thank you for that warm welcome, which I so richly deserve, but so seldom get. You know, whenever I hear amazing music, I'm always reminded of the fact that music will be the language of heaven. So for those of you who play and get interrupted because someone like me has to come and flap my gums, when we get to heaven, you guys are not, you're going to be busy. We're going to be unemployed hearing you forever. So thanks for that amazing worship. I live in the great state of Texas. 3 rules. If it's moving, we tend to hug it. If it's not, we sell it. If it argues, we shoot it. So I'm fairly simple. I kind of live life on very simple rules. I came to America in 1986 with $9 in my pocket. We were poor. Someone asked me, how poor were you? We were so poor, we go to Kentucky Fried Chicken and lick other people's fingers. So we didn't have tracks to be on the other side off, but we did have running water. If you needed it, you ran and got it. But something very quickly I saw as a cataclysmic shift when I came to America. We landed in Dallas watching the television. The first night I told my bride, we're going to make it. She said, why? I said, these people think they have problems. So here we are going into the July 4th weekend. For some it's a date. For some it's a remembrance. For some it's a memory. For others it's a gathering. We don fancy apparel that kind of looks like the stars and stripes. We are a little more reverent in our patriotism. But we gather together and gastronomically consume large amounts of food, all in the name of the belief that we are now free. But somewhere along the line, America lost its cultural moorings. Isaac Watts put it this way: why do the nations join to slay the Lord's anointed Son? Why do they cast his laws away and tread his gospel down? The Lord who reigns above the sky derides their rage below, and speaks with vengeance in his eyes and casts their spirits through. I call him my anointed Son and raise him from the dead. I made my holy hill his throne, and wide his kingdom spread. Ask me, my son, and then enjoy the utmost heathen lands, the rod of iron that defines, the rebel that withstands. Be wise, ye nations of the earth, obey the anointed Lord, adore the King of heavenly birth, and tremble at his word. With humble love address his throne, for if he frown, you die. Those are secure and those alone who on his word rely. America, a nation born out of a spiritual heritage, and I'll prove it to you. Somewhere along the line, post-Vietnam, its cultural soul came home in a body bag. Now, I'm an immigrant. I don't have a dog in this fight. I tell people I ain't black, I ain't white, I'm Twilight. I got 2 homes in India that nobody can tax if they try. This is not political. It's not even bureaucratic. My definition of bureaucracy is a corrupt group of inept people totally committed to the concept of radically increasing the size of their numbers so they can somehow take pure raw energy and convert it into solid waste. I'm talking about practicality. How then do we return to the basics? The scripture that always fascinates me is Psalm 33:12. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance. When did we walk away from belief? When did the church stop becoming the foundation? The first book introduced into the colonies was the New England Primer by Benjamin Harrison. And the first graders had to learn 6 polysyllabic words: abomination, desolation. They had to memorize entire hymns like the one I just shared. And is it any wonder that a nation in its early infancy produced the likes of Washington and Monroe and Adams and Jefferson? And you tell me someone of that ilk we have produced in the last 50 years. I know somewhere along the line we walked away saying that, you know what? I don't want to believe all the stuff that was told. E. Stanley Jones said, we have inoculated the world with a mild form of Christianity, so it's practically immune against the real thing. When did we go away from this belief that America was not a religious country? When did we go away from this foundational? And for those of you who are hearing it for the second time, you might be wondering why I'm taking a different track. I'm steeped in the belief that unless you excite yourself every time, don't say anything. So I change some of my narrative so I stay excited. But the beauty of this approach is just that. I'm reminded of an anecdotal story that Ravi Zacharias told many years ago. And it's a story of Sherlock Holmes and Watson lying on the side of a mountain. It was a little past midnight when Holmes judges Watson and says, Watson, old chap, what do you see? Watson says, well, Holmes, I see billions of stars. And Holmes says, what does that mean to you? He said, astrologically, I think Saturn is in Leo. Astronomically, I think there are billions of stars and millions of galaxies. Orologically, I think it's around 2 o'clock. Meteorologically, I think it'll be a clear day tomorrow. Theologically, I marvel at God's amazing wonder. Why, Holmes, what do you see? And Holmes said, Watson, you idiot, someone stole our tent. So somewhere in the grand expanse of belief and experimentation, we are now waking up and looking at an America where the tent has been stolen. Now, I'm a first-generation immigrant, but I've traveled all over the free world. I've seen America's goodness, just like Tocqueville said in his Democracy in America. When he came to America at the age of 25, France and America got their independence around the same time, and he was wondering why America was flourishing, but France was struggling. And he gave some edicts that have been paraphrased differently, but basically what he was saying was, America is good because of her goodness and her religiosity. 99% of this country have some kind of a foundational belief, and a country so desperate to change its identity for the 1% who have no belief. Which in business terms, which I'm a business guy, is just bad marketing. So how then do we go back? Let me take you through a quick narrative. And for those of you who disagree with what I say, it's okay. I'm a legal immigrant. For those of you who are wondering how can a guy who looks like he was participated in 9/11, no, you got the numbers wrong. I participated in 7/11. All right? First step is return to basics. So, if you return to basics, you would be told this nonsense. That our founding fathers were not deists. They were deists. Many of them were humanists. Some were atheists. But to call them religious Christians would be a stretch. Well, Thomas Jefferson was a deist, by his own admission. But a deist then and a deist now is a huge difference if you look at the definition, because they believed in a God. They may not have believed in the Christian God, some of them, but some of them were Quakers, some of them were Puritans, some of them were Episcopalians, some of them were Anglicans. They all, here's the irony, no matter what they believed, they believed. So let's start with that foundational premise. So if we return to the basics and begin to understand the common sense that kind of governs us, let's look at the very words of the Declaration of Independence of that great soul, Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident. For it to be self-evident, it has to be birthed in a moral law that comes from a moral lawgiver. That among these truths are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the biggest fight on the American lexicon is to extinguish life before it even begins. Liberty is now being bathed in tyranny. And happiness is whatever you define it to be, but happiness is different from joy. See, happiness depends on happenings, but joy is undiluted, it's unadulterated, it's pure. And Fred Smith Sr. said, joy is adequate. Where has the joy gone in a nation where people like me are coming from far off shores and saying, let me in? I was in Istanbul, Turkey, and there was a parade going on, an anti-American parade. And they looked at me and I said, what's that parade about? They said, oh, these are people who hate America. I said, well, you know, I think they're not doing it well. People who really hate it already live there. And you're saying that's a little harsh. It is harsh. Because one day we're going to wake up and realize that this great and grandiose promise that this July 4th will be 242 years. When a ragtag bunch of militiamen decided to stand up and take on the armies of the mighty Imperial Britain. And I'll prove to you through people. When George Washington was praying in that famous picture in Valley Forge where he's kneeling down beside his horse, a person from the rival party, if you go and read the documents, Isaiah Potts says, when I saw that kind of a prayer of a man praying that the armies of God would be preserved and democracy and freedom would prevail, he says, I realized that a prayer like that would only mean that God was on his side. But we don't want to read. The Thomas Jefferson Research Institute said by 1955 the percentage of morality in teaching in American schools was so minuscule that it was not even worth being counted. Here's a statement. We're not going to save America in the White House. We're not even going to save it in the schoolhouse. with all the redefining going on about identity and biological experiments, we may not even be able to save America in the outhouse. Until we get on our knees and beg the living God to save America in God's house. That's right. Adrian Rogers, that great preacher, said, we are raising a generation based on rights, and all we are seeing are revolutions. We need to raise them based on responsibility so we may have revival. Amen. What are we doing on Sunday? See, folks, there's no Sunday identity and Monday identity. There is no Sunday church identity and Monday secular identity. For the last 30 years, I've straddled the line of secular and sacred, trying not to irritate either. But I will never, ever stop doubting the beauty of Jesus and the grandeur of what I believe, no matter who the audience is. You know why? One of these days, I will have to have accountability. As Adrian Rogers also said, if you don't feel the devil, you're probably walking in the same direction. America as an experiment is like a sporting event now. 75,000 people desperately in need of exercise, yelling at 22 people desperately need a rest. Life is not a spectator sport, it is a participator sport. So let's walk through this. First, return to basics. Second, review common sense. Let's go back to Thomas Jefferson. See, Benjamin Rush, a Methodist preacher who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, actually had an angst about the fact that Adams and Jefferson were fighting with each other. Adams and Jefferson were friends. But when Jefferson unseated Adams and became the third president of the United States, Adams left Washington and retired to Quincy. But here were two of the most erudite scholars who some of their writings shaped and framed this republic. And Benjamin Rush said he was bothered by the fact that these two great giants would not reconcile. And he said, I had a dream that God reconciled you, and he wrote to Adams. Adams said, that cannot be any policy, it's probably prophecy. Rush went on to write to Jefferson, and they went back and forth. In fact, Abigail Adams wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson when he lost a child. But they were bitter enemies. But Benjamin Rush said, God has given me this vision that you will reconcile. So for about 13 years before they died, they began slowly a correspondence which became mammoth volumes that is now housed in the Library of Congress. Many of you will not know this. But come July 4th of 1826, something monumental happened in this country's history. With John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, those bitter rivals, were both reconciled on the same day. God called them home. They both died 50 years to the date of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams' last words at 1 p.m. that afternoon when he was getting ready to pass was what? Thank God this nation still has Thomas Jefferson, not knowing Jefferson had passed away 3 hours earlier. Let's fast forward to that monumental speech given by Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster was called to memorialize these two people on August 2nd of 1826 in Massachusetts. And he said, but the concurrence of their death on the anniversary of independence has naturally awakened stronger emotions. Both had been president. Both had lived to great age. Both were early patriots, and both were distinguished and ever honored by their immediate agency in the act of independence. It cannot but seem striking and extraordinary that these two should live to see the 50th year from the date of their act, that they should complete that year, and that then, on the day which had fast linked forever their own fame with their country's glory, the heavens should open to receive them both at once, as their lives themselves were the gifts of providence, who is not willing to recognize in their happy termination, as well as in their long continuance, proof that our country and its benefactors are objects of his care. 50 years. When I share this story, many people come up to me and says, I was born here, I didn't know that. And here's the irony. What are we teaching? If the teaching in our youth and teaching in our schools is teaching that is counterintuitive to what produced a nation where millions like me wanted to come. If you ever want to be awakened when you go to New York, let's not look at the recency of 9/11, which was a dastardly attack and which was cowardly. But let's maybe take that boat ride out to Ellis Island and see the inscription on the Statue of Liberty, which was Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus. And ask yourself, why? See, America is too young to have problems. Most of our antiques are plastic. A 200-year plus, 242 plus year republic. We're boasting of legacies that are thousands of years old. And yet God, in His infinite wisdom, somehow kept this pocket. I'm very, very passionate, but I'm very, very scared. Because I came to this country to find a better life for my son. And when I look at what he grew up with and some of the drivel that he'd been educated with, the academy is so corrupting what we are asked to believe. And like I said, this is about as theological as I get. I'm a layperson. I haven't been to seminary. I've yet to go to cemetery. So first, return to basics. Review common sense. Third, revive original foundations. Whether they were deists, whether they were whatever, it doesn't really matter. How many of you knew that Patrick Henry, who gave that great speech, when he stood up in front of the House of Burgesses on March 23rd of 1775, Second Congress, and he said, "Mr. President, this is no time for ceremony." And he goes on to add that, "Give me liberty or give me death. It is vain, sir, to extenuate the circumstances. Gentlemen cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has already begun. The next gale that sweeps in from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Why stand we here idle? Our brethren are already in the field. What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? For is life so dear or peace so sweet that it be purchased at the price of chains of slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. For I know not what path others might take, but for me give me liberty or death." How many of you knew that when he was not giving these speeches that immortalize history, he was handing out tracts? Folks, we have to get back to the moorings of some belief. We cannot have a Sunday identity and a Monday identity. We have to have a 24-hour God-given identity. We are living lives of quiet desperation. My colleague Michael Ramsden says modern-day Christians are like communists. They have nothing to give, but they want to share it with you. And most of the places, every church I've been to has been started by 3 people who disagreed with the previous one. We constantly run around trying to find an identity, and the identity was given to us as a nation. Reality, folks, just because we hold our breath, the universe doesn't suffocate. Today, some of you are thinking to yourself, "Man, I came to hear a motivational lecture. This guy is just really a Debbie Downer." And the reality is that, as an immigrant, if I feel this way, how much do you who've had the privilege of being born in this country need to feel? Where will our patriotism come from? It's not just standing. It's not just saluting. It's that fundamental belief that you're willing to fight for it. Life is not a popularity contest. If it was, we'd lose. Someone asked me one time, "You talk a good game. What do you want the pastor to say when you're dying or when you're dead?" I want the pastor to say, "He's still moving." My friend Brian Tracy used to put it this way: if you're incapable of doing anything, set yourself on fire. At least give other people the privilege of coming to watch you burn. Don't just sit there to get there. Sit there to arrive more informed. Everybody else has figured this out. Mr. Ziglar wrote a book called Over the Top in the early 90s. He said, "Why are legal immigrants 4 times as likely to succeed in this country as native-born? When we give up everything. Language, identity, opportunity." I could not make a phone call. I was so petrified that people would make fun of my accent. Today, the Indian accent is the only one that can be legally mocked. You know why? The Indian community is the only one that does not object. It has now surpassed the Jewish community as the most affluent, and it has already been the most educated. Indians own motels, ha ha ha. Did you know they own $100 billion worth? Someone's laughing all the way to the bank, and they're doing it with an accent. It's not about geography, it's not about demographics, it's understanding the foundation moorings of how these men on knees, when Benjamin Franklin said, "He who will not allow a sparrow to fall in the wilderness without his approval, will he allow an empire to rise without his presence?" And they brand him a deist. He was smarter than most of the pastors at that time, most well-read man in the colonies. Nobody could hold his attention. Read 4 Great Americans by James Baldwin, which talks and chronicles about the life of George Washington, of Benjamin Franklin, of Abraham Lincoln, and Daniel Webster. And you'll begin to get a glimpse of how God shaped these very people and gave them the thoughts. So first, return to basics. Second, review common sense. Third, revive original foundation. Fourth and fifth, real quick, renew our hope. And finally, resurrect his name. Here's Isaiah Potts' statement. In that woods pointing to a close in view, I heard a plaintive sound as if man at prayer. I tied my horse to a sapling and went quietly into the woods. In my astonishment, I saw the great George Washington on his knees, alone with a sword on one side and his cocked hat on the other. He was at prayer to God of armies, beseeching to interpose with his divine aid, as it was a crisis, and the cause of the country, of humanity, and the world. Such a prayer I have never heard from the lips of man. I left him alone praying. See, when the great revival took place and Jonathan Edwards was preaching, someone said, the people in the church were clinging to the pillars because they did not want to be swept away into the hell he was talking about. I don't know how many of you see and foresee a calamity that is coming across this nation. And I'm not talking about the fight against Christianity, because that fight has already been in the streets. See, you remove Christ from Christianity and the whole construct collapses. You remove Muhammad from Islam, Allah still remains. You take out Buddha from Buddhism and Nirvana can still be achieved. You take out any of the gods out of Hinduism's pantheon of gods, there are many millions of gods, and some construct of reincarnation will still be available. We are unique in every sense of the word, and these early founders attested to that. Some modern day folks say, well, you know, since they were deists, they used the word creator, and they didn't use the word God. Our declaration has endowed by a creator. Well, the Bible is the only one that talks about creation and a creator. The Genesis account. No, like I said, I'm not a seminarian. I believe the Bible from Genesis to maps. Some of you are saying, no, it ends at Revelation. No, I've been around the world. Most of the problems are about the maps. And if you look at your own, hear what we did, folks. And I've done this too, I'm guilty. We said we don't want to fight. So first, people looked at us and said, yeah, America is a melting pot. Nobody really knows what happened. We're supposed to welcome everybody. Of course you're supposed to welcome everybody. We're supposed to welcome everything. Here's where Ravi Zacharias says something pivotal happened. First came secularization. Everything should be allowed. We're, after all, a free people. Next came pluralization. If everything is allowed, anything should be allowed. Man and barn, man and barnyard. Once secularization and pluralization arrived, privatization was sure to follow, where we said, I can't play anymore. I'm going to retreat to suburbia, raise my fences, and raise my children. Now we are sending our children back into that corrupt world that we ran away from, whose laws are different from the laws of originality, whose morality has no right and wrong, no good and bad, no black and white. It's completely abstract. So here's what we now do as well-meaning people. First, they said, accept. We did. Then they said, acknowledge, it's here to stay. And we did. Then they said, since you've accepted and acknowledged, why don't you approve? And you and I begrudgingly stood in line and voted for or against behavior. Once you accept and acknowledge and approve, the last step from Socrates onwards has always been applaud. You and I have become spectators applauding for something we disagreed with. 242 years, men fought. And when they signed that declaration, in a couple of weeks I'll speak at Independence Hall in Pennsylvania, where we'll bring a young group of people, and at the end of the talks we give them, we will bring out the original declaration, and all of them have to sign it. Endowed by a creator God. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, not guaranteed happiness. Truths, self-evident. What happened? Let me close with a simple illustration. We are now reaching Orwellian proportions. George Orwell wrote a book called 1984, which he wrote in 1948. And if you've read the book, reread it. Because everything he predicted in totalitarianism is now happening, because that's what happens when God is jettisoned. One of the people in the previous break asked me, he says, how would you explain this? Folks, we have replaced morality with the word justice. When you replace morality with justice, you take out a moral lawgiver and you put a judge. Orwell predicted 3 moods, and then I'll hush. He said, there will come a time when ignorance will be strength. Most of us disagree with what we hear. We hear it anyway. I jokingly tell people I read my Bible every day and I read the newspaper every day. That way I know what both sides are up to. He said freedom will be slavery. We're more free now than at any other time in human history, most enslaved by regulation and petrified. And yet the Declaration of Independence says rights of the governed, not the governing. Where did it happen? Because somehow in our narrow-minded, myopic way, we actually believe America is a democracy where majority rules. America was never intended to be a democracy. That's why Benjamin Franklin put it this way. He said, democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting that vote. But what do I know? Till you have collected your entire belongings and stood in a line that said U.S. citizen this way, others this way. Till you were taken to a room and processed for 2 hours to prove you're worthy of staying here in New York airport. Till you don't know where the next meal is going to come from. But I've never taken one amount of welfare from anybody. You know why? Emerson said, if you're going to pull me up, you better be on higher ground. I've always looked for someone who can help me. Pull me up intellectually, because that was the American way. Daniel Webster was sent away to Exeter Academy when he was 15, but his brother, who was not as brilliant, Ezekiel, was asked to till the land. And his father said, we only have limited resources, we're going to invest in one, and we're not going to invest in the other. You're the older, you're going to stay with me, the younger one is more promising. Well, that's biblical. Just look at the story of Jacob and Esau in God's own word. And Ezekiel stays home, Daniel goes off. By 20, he's a practicing lawyer, thriving. Country calls him, he goes back, he educates Ezekiel, hands the law practice to him, and then goes off. That's what we were designed to do. We're supposed to help each other. Capitalism has always been the uneven distribution of wealth. Communism is always the even distribution of misery. We need to pick a side. And as my mentor Zig Ziglar would always say, son, if you put one foot in boiling hot water and the other foot in ice cold water, on average you're miserable. We need to pick a side. So today, from this humble immigrant who's reached and achieved the American dream, who's lived it the way that I never dreamt possible. But when I study American history and see the travesty that is happening in this nation, my heart breaks. And I've come to the conclusion, till America gets back on its knees and starts praying to the God of heavens, saying, Lord, we have turned our back on you because we have refused to understand how blessed we are, this nation may face a peril from which it will never recover. Let me close simply by saying, our Father's God, from out whose hand the centuries flow like grains of sand, we stand together, united, free, loyal to our land and thee. And thank thee for the era done, but trust only thee for the coming one. Folks, I can tell you without any fear of error, of all the people I've ever had the privilege of sharing this message with, you guys are the most recent.